I'm so happy to have Fox & Sons Coffee as a sponsor of this show for a few reasons. One, Steven, the owner of this company, has been a proud supporter of the show for quite some time. So two, I get to help him sell his product. And then three, this is selfish, but I also get to drink it every morning, and I really, really like it. So I'm proud to sell this product. Here's his story, and these are his words. I don't even want to translate them through how I would say this because this is so wonderfully put. When I was growing up, I would often go to work with my dad on Saturdays. Those were special father and son days. We would go out for breakfast, and he would let me have a cup of coffee. These memories of sharing breakfast and a cup of coffee with my amazing father will always be my favorite memories of him. He has been the best influence in my life, and I am forever grateful for those days. I believe this is where my lifelong love for coffee began, and that's why I have created Fox & Sons Coffee, LLC. Here are his goals, ladies and gentlemen. He wants to share his appreciation for absolutely awesome coffee, and he knows you'll agree once you try it. I should say, I know you will agree too, because it is awesome. He wants to honor his father and pass on a business and the spirit of entrepreneurship to his two sons. How about that? Please tell your friends and family about this coffee. It's Fox & Sons Coffee. The website is foxinsons.com. That's F-O-X, the letter N, S-O-N-S.com. Now check this out. You guys know I'm running for city council here in Lockhart, Texas. You also know the Mises Mayor's Pact is a PAC fund that is, well, helping me fund certain parts of this campaign. Can we say that? Is that legal? But you know what I'm talking about. I will tell you this. Steven, the owner of Fox & Sons, is such a proud supporter of this show. He's going to donate $1 per each order that he sells of Fox & Sons coffee to the Mises Mayor's Pact, who then in turn, well, helps me out in my run for city council in Lockhart, Texas. So you get delicious coffee, you're helping out a great supporter of this show, and then you're helping me run for city council. How fun is that? And I'm going to need more coffee, I have a feeling. So keep the Fox & Sons coffee coming. Once again, that's foxinsons.com. Let's get back to the show.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, cause I call the hologram graph, but I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus, but I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. Great to have you with me here again this week, where, as I record this, last night was the candidate forum, Meet the Candidates here for City Council in Lockhart, the 2022 slate of candidates, which, as most of you know, includes me. And I had a good time. So just to clarify all of this, the position I'm running for is City Council at large, meaning I don't represent, or I wouldn't, if I were to be elected, represent a specific district like the one I live in. The at-large people, and there's two spots. There's two at-large spots. They represent all of Lockhart in the city council. So that's the deal. Like I said, there's two spots. There's three people running. Basically, I'm the outsider. I'm running against the two incumbents. We all got to speak last night. There were questions for each of us, 5 total questions. We each answered the same questions, and it was interesting. I thought it went well. I'm pretty hard on myself. I will say this, my opponents, the gentleman that I'm running against, is a very nice guy, very polished, and has been doing this a long time. The lady I'm running against is, what a sweet person she is. Nonetheless, here we are, and I'll quit boring you guys with my talk of my own political campaign, and let's get to this talk here with Jim Jatras. So what's going on in Ukraine with Russia? If you're listening to this, you probably don't really trust the mainstream narrative of what's really going on. And it kind of changes from day to day. It almost seems like they're trying to say, well, Russia's losing. They're going to go crazy. He's going to nuke everyone at any moment. And then you hear, well, not so fast. Maybe Russia's making some headway. And I never know who to trust when I hear mainstream voices, certainly, on this topic. But I do know I can trust Jim Jatras on it. And then we also get into something I wanted to get out there for listeners is the correct approach and correct Orthodox view on Israel. Because the state of Israel, the country of Israel, and I mean, when I say state, I mean capital S state of Israel now, some people have this misconception that it's, oh my God, it's the Holy Land and it's this and it's that, and these are the chosen people and whatnot. I wanted to get out there the correct Orthodox view of Israel and what our tradition and history and everything says about it. So we're going to get into that as well. I've got Jim Jatras on, like I said. He's a former US diplomat and foreign policy advisor to the Senate GOP leadership. He comments on financial and foreign policy topics and on US politics. He's got all kinds of great writing. I'm going to link to a lot of them. He's written for Chronicles magazine many times over the years. Just all around great guy, brilliant man, and he's here on Counterflow. Jim Jatras, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
I'm fine. Great to be here, Buck. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate this. I'll say up front for those listening, you, in my opinion, are the best guy out there to speak on Russia, Ukraine, these kind of things that are happening geopolitically right now. And I'm not saying that because you're on this show right now. I've got you on this show because I really believe that. So I'm happy to have you here. Before we dive into it, quickly, if you'd like, because I know you're on so many shows and I hear you always give your intro. I don't want you to get tired of doing that, but you do have quite an extensive, interesting resume. So tell my audience anything you think they should know pertinent to what we're going to discuss.
Well, just to start with, if I'm the best guy on these topics, I think you should get out more and meet more people because I don't know that I'm necessarily the best. I try to do my best. Again, not to repeat everything I've repeated before, growing up in an Air Force family, having a law degree, working at the State Department for about 6.5 years, primarily with regard to what was still then the Soviet Union, Soviet affairs. And then working on Capitol Hill, the US Senate Republican leadership for many years, primarily on foreign policy topics, and then working in the lobbying world at Washington for a few years, and now being just a retired Virginia country gentleman. So that's pretty much me. I do try to keep up with the events while I'm chasing my chickens around and trying to shoot the foxes that are eating my chickens sometimes and things of that sort. But keep my priorities straight. But other than that, one thing I would point out to people is that if you Google me, you will find a number of writings going back many years. If you go, for example, to uns.org, they have a archive of my writings. Just put in Jatras in the author search that go back to the the 1990s. Talking about many trends that I think we're seeing today. I mean, I don't think I've met too many people in the 1990s were predicting what I called then rainbow fascism. This idea that we would have this all-inclusive ideology, feminism, homosexualism, consumerism, all of these things that we would be trying to implant throughout the world and are now throwing the world into turmoil. That certainly has come to pass. And so I think people can go there. They can go to the archive on Strategic Culture Foundation or to Chronicles magazine. So I've largely stopped writing, I have to admit. I guess my muse has deserted me. I just don't have the time and mental discipline to write. But I can blab like anybody else. I may be like Laconian by ethnic origin, but I'm not laconic of speech.
Well done. And also, I guess we should throw in, especially now considering some of the new listeners of this show, you were born into Orthodox Christianity, correct?
Yes, I'm. My parents were born here, but all four of my grandparents were from Sparta in Greece, and so I, was born Orthodox. Although I must say I didn't really have much of an Orthodox upbringing. My father was in the military. We didn't live in a Greek community. When we went to church, it was mostly the Protestant chapel on the Air Force Base, which was not that often. And it was only, I think in some ways, my formation is more like that of a convert. Now, my wife in her family were always more religious than mine. So that certainly had an influence. But I think I went through the same kind of crisis in my early 20s that a lot of people did. For me, it largely was going to Georgetown Law School and seeing what a pit of nihilism it was morally. And that's what really started me looking at, say, wait a minute, I'm looking into a deep, dark pit. There's got to be something better here. And then at that point, obviously Orthodoxy was the default go-to place for me, unlike many other people in America who have to go through Roman Catholicism or 16 Protestant denominations before they finally get here.
What that's interesting. The part of your resume I find, I guess, most interesting, and maybe this is just me, but the State Department stuff, because I'm always wondering what goes on in the State Department, because that's often thrown into, well, that's part of the deep state, and just these people, these career State Department types that kind of have their own bureaucratic ideology, it almost seems like. And I'm not throwing that on you, of course, but what lessons did you take away from the State Department?
It is a bureaucratic organization. In fact, I would say the Foreign Service thinks of itself as kind of a priesthood, almost like they have a preemptive right to control America's foreign policy. I mean, I think you saw this a little bit with the Trump impeachment about his talking to the president of Ukraine and trying. Well, the president can't do that. He's departing from the consensus of the interagency process. Excuse me, the Constitution of the United States says the executive power shall be invested in a president of the United States. Doesn't say anything about any agencies or interagency process or consensus of bureaucrats. So you have them at the Pentagon, you have them at the State Department, you have them at the Justice Department, and so on and so forth. A lot of them are very, very good people, very intelligent people, very patriotic people. But just as we see in the military, where you're not going to get to be a general unless you're with the program. You're
right.
not. You're being vetted and groomed are you part of the Borg or not? And if you're not, you're never going to be a general. In the State Department, if you're not, you're never going to be an ambassador. And there are rare exceptions to that, but they're very rare indeed. And it's that's kind of organization.
Yeah. I very well put. I want to ask you, I've heard you discuss the fact that this might have already become World War III with what's going on geopolitically. Is that the case?
I think it is. I mean, I don't think that the Russians would have laid down their ultimatum in late 2021 and then launched this operation in February unless they knew it was going to be a global confrontation with the Western structures led by the U.S. And when I say the U.S., I'm sure you feel the same thing as I do as an American, how painful this is to see that our woke establishment, that is, let's be honest, is trying to abolish the America that we all thought we grew up in, or maybe even more so me, because I remember an earlier America, and then is trying to spread these poisons around the world. Like I always like to say, there's no transatlanticism without transgenderism. I mean, basically the U.S. government and the Soros agenda are like this globally. And in fact, you look at American embassies, especially in places like Eastern Europe, they work hand in glove with the Soros and the other woke NGOs to try to impose these, let's be honest, godless Gnostic values on the rest of humanity. That, unfortunately, is what we have to live as Americans to say, this is our government doing these things. And so many Americans, especially conservative ones, have a sort of a sense of this when we're dealing with domestic affairs. Why are they always pushing drag queen story hour and things like that? Why are they pushing the little thing that we can't talk about without getting censored?
Right.
But they assume that when we go abroad and we're talking about the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians or whoever, it's all mom and apple pie. It's all the American we used to know. No, truth, justice, the American way. Well, it's not. It's the very same crowd. And they're trying to do the same thing to the rest of the world as they're trying to do the American people. So I don't think the Russians would have taken on this confrontation. First off, if they didn't know they had the Chinese backing them up, if they didn't have a sense that other countries like India and the rest of the world would fall more or less in their direction, but also that for them it was existential, not just with regard to Ukraine, but I think they understood that from the beginning. This was something that was supposed to culminate in regime change in Moscow. When you hear Nancy Pelosi and other people in the administration talking about this is a fight between democracy and autocracy. Well, we know what democracy means to these people. It means all the woke values, but autocracy, what they seem to mean is that you have strong leaders in some countries who say, hey, my country comes first. That's what Donald Trump ran on, right? America first. Well, for Putin, it's Russia first. For Xi, it's China first. For Modi, it's India first. And hey, isn't that their job? Viktor Orban, it's Hungary first. I say that that's what a national leader is supposed to do. Sure, you want to be friendly with other countries, get along with them, do business with them, But the idea that you would try to take a globalist agenda to squish national sovereignty, squish national traditions, national values, especially religious values, especially I would say as an Orthodox Christian in Christianity and especially in the Orthodox countries. Remember, the Orthodox countries were the ones that were almost all entirely under communist domination. The only ones, the exceptions being Greece and Cyprus. And it's interesting to me that you'll find in Eastern Europe that was under communism, they actually withstood modernism somewhat better than Western Europe did in terms of preserving their national and religious identity. Not just Orthodox countries, but also Poland, Hungary, and some of the other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. That is really where the real global struggle is. It's not just kinetic or military in Ukraine. It's not even just a global financial and economic confrontation. It's also the woke ideology versus national sovereignty, tradition, and religion. And by that, its very nature is multipolar. So that's what I think we're really facing right now. And unfortunately, it's become an existential crisis for both sides. The Russians know they cannot lose this. The Chinese know they cannot afford to let the Russians lose this. At the same time, the Western wokesters know that they can't lose it either, because if they do, I think they worry about their whole house of cards, the whole Davos Great Reset agenda, which depends on Washington as its enforcer, may come crashing down too. And I think that means, just as the collapse of the Soviet Empire meant a regime change in Moscow 30 years ago and communism falling, I think there's a real fear that grips people like Brandon and that cackling idiot who's set to take his place and the other people we have around Washington and Wall Street and in Hollywood and all the rest of it, the pharmaceutical community, all the rest of it. I think they fear that if American power, and again, I put American in quotes, goes down, that we face a crisis here in the United States similar to what the Soviet Union went through in the 1990s. Maybe, I hope, that provides a chance for the real American ethos, the real Americans who, preserve the traditions and value the traditions of our founding fathers and what the American Republic was supposed to be, going back even to the centuries of English tradition before that we can recover that. That's my hope anyway.
Yeah, me too. And it seems bleak sometimes when I look around, but you can get online too much. And I'm definitely guilty of that. And you see the fighting online and it just seems like there's not enough of those people with the old school tradition in them, but we shall see. It's interesting. You're saying, and I totally agree with this, and it's a good perspective, I think, this war that could be starting is essentially a military war, but it's multipolar. We're looking at the culture war expanding across the world, and a lot of Americans are going to hear this and say, let me rephrase that. Some old school conservative Americans will hear this and say, well, wait a second, what am I supposed to do? Side with Russia here? Because it sounds like they're saying Russia is the old school traditional side of this battle, and America is this woke progressivism that I hate. What are your thoughts there? I mean, that seems to be the case, yes?
Yeah, and and of course that really upsets you. I mean, it sort of makes me wonder, sort of, if you were like a Solzhenitsyn or somebody, a conservative Russian patriot living in a country, or for that matter, Poland or Hungary, any of those countries, knowing that you had a bunch of nihilists and basically criminals running your country for you, and you still love your country and you love its traditions and values, which are being suppressed by these very same people, and then you find yourself at war or in a confrontation with another country, and on the one hand you're saying, I love my country, I want to defend it, I want to protect it, I want its interests to be served. At the same time, I know that people who are running my country are not serving those interests, and in fact, they're trying to destroy them. Do I want them to succeed? And that's, how do you square that in your own mind? I don't know. I guess to me, in my short-term way of looking at it, is saying, I want what's best for America and for the American people, and what's best for the American people is not for our nihilist Gnostic rulers to spread their poison in the world and to keep trying to poison and destroy the American people. If the war with the Russians goes bad, if we get into a real war, with a shooting war between the two countries, at that point, well, first off, we might end up all dead anyway if it turns out to be nuclear, so we won't have to worry about it. But I really hope that whatever this confrontation turns to, I guess the best way to put it is I hope there's a soft landing for the local American empire, the way there was a soft landing for the communist empire, that somehow it managed to collapse and a healthy, more or less, after some turmoil, country managed to rise out of it. I think that would be the best outcome. But obviously that's in God's hands to a great extent. I don't think there's much we as individuals can do to affect the big picture. I think we could try to use our discernment, try not to be deceived, try to pray and uphold the best values we can. But this is a big historic process, I think.
Mm-hmm. Where are we as far as militarily what's going on? Because the mainstream media keeps saying Russia's losing this, and it looks like our quote unquote our side is winning here. Where are things on that footing at this moment?
As I mentioned elsewhere, the two of the people I very much respect are Colonel Douglas Macgregor and also Dr. Sergei Trifkovich, who writes in Chronicles magazine. And they have very different views about this. Trifkovich believes that the Russians are falling into the same errors he saw the Serbs fall into, especially in Bosnia in the 1990s, that they keep looking for some diplomatic solution. And even when they have the military advantage, they don't press it because they want to give the other space to negotiate. And of course, that turned out very badly for them. He sees Putin doing the same thing. Macgregor, on the other hand, believes that the Russians are fighting a war in a very deliberate way, certainly not to break Ukraine up or destroy Ukraine or kill too many people there. And I agree that that's certainly the case. And it does appear that they are pressing toward a military victory, and that all the talk that they will say, oh, we're willing to negotiate, they know that there cannot be a negotiated solution to this. The question is whether or not they will prosecute the war with a sufficient, let's say, vigor to actually bring it to an end that does not allow the other side, the Western side supporting the Zelensky regime, to escalate this to a point where to a point of non-return. And as things stand right now, it appears, and again, Macgregor has written about this, that what the Ukrainians have done is made the same errors the Germans did as the Red Army was advancing, of throwing men and materiel into strategically pointless engagements to recover or hold worthless ground, and by doing so, chewing up the last of their reserves in manpower and materiel. Once they're gone, there's nothing to replace it. At the same time, the Russians appear to be building up for a huge offensive. That the amount of fuel, for example, being delivered to the Russian forces, and of course, Russia has unlimited fuel resources at its disposal, unlike the Ukrainians, that they're getting set up for a very big push. Most people expect that's going to come in the southwest part of Ukraine, from Nikolaev toward Transnistria, cutting off Odessa from the rest of Ukraine. I can't believe that they would finish this war without taking at least Kharkov and Odessa, and I think possibly a lot more than that. My concern would be that if there is some kind of a peace deal, that what's going to end up happening, it'll become a kind of a Minsk III, where Moscow will take half a loaf and accept what it basically amounts to another peace agreement that they have to trust the promises of the Western powers. And, frankly, Brandon and company cannot be trusted anymore on the international scene than it can be trusted domestically. I think if that were to happen, it would be a disaster, not just for the Russians, but for everybody, because it would almost guarantee, in my opinion, another war even more devastating in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Do you see this? There's, when people say, well, it could go nuclear here, everyone gets scared. Naturally, that's a human instinct. No one wants that. Do you think that's a legitimate possibility in the next 6 months?
I think it's a concern. I don't think it's a very great chance, but it is a chance. And I think what worries me most is, to start with, there's virtually zero prospect the Russians are going to use nuclear weapons themselves, or at least initiate anything on a nuclear of a nuclear nature. Why would they? They're winning. That's what I believe that's happening. I think one of the things that worries me about all this propaganda, oh, Moscow's losing, Moscow's desperate, they're out of missiles, all this other stuff, which is simply patently false, is that it could be seen as preparing the ground for a false flag, for some kind of a nuclear incident, which they say, oh, look what the Russians did. Because after all, what do you hear them saying in the West? Oh, the Russians are losing, they're getting desperate. You better not resort to nuclear weapons. You better not resort to nuclear weapons. Well, Putin is threatening to use nuclear weapons, which of course he has not done. That worries me because it makes me think, what do these guys do whenever they get caught in a fight? They don't like to lose. So, for example, every time in Syria that the Syrian army with the Russian Air Force support was making pretty great gains on the battlefield, what did we see? Another chemical false flag attack of some sort coming from the jihadists and their sponsors in MI6. Right. We saw that in Bosnia, by the way. And again, one reason, Dr. Triffitt, gets to worry so much is that every time it looked like the Bosnian Serbs were in a position of advantage and were basically going into negotiation with positive momentum on their side, what would happen? We'd have a Serbian mortar shell attack on civilians, killing a bunch of civilians. Oh, look what the Serbs did. They just massacred a bunch of civilians. These people they're doing that already, by the way, with this offensive now, where just like they did at Bucha, they have a bunch of people that almost certainly, in fact, Jacob Dreisen on the Dreisen report has published an excellent piece on this, that what they're doing, what's happening is these I'm not even sure the right word, these extreme nationalists and the SVU, the Ukrainian KGB, are killing people suspected of being Russian sympathizers and then saying, oh, look what the Russians did. Right. And of course, the Russians don't control the global media. The CNN, people like that are just bulletin boards for the intelligence services in the Pentagon. So I do worry we could be facing a very devastating provocation, false flag coming from the usual suspects.
Mm-hmm. What's Putin's intent with this? Because there obviously in the mainstream media, there's a narrative. This is Putin's war. He started this. This is all him invading another country. You can't just go and take a bunch of land from someone and expect to get off scot-free. What if, from his perspective, what do you think his end game is here?
I think that's shifted over time. But let's remember that I could tell you from professional experience working in Ukraine for several years that the Russians were barely engaged in that country. It was actually scandalous how little attention they paid for it. Well, a lot of American money was going in. I think was it $5 billion that Victoria Nuland referred to basically build up these forces that culminated in the coup in 2014, where a little, in my opinion, an illegitimate, unconstitutional regime seized power with the aid of the Western powers, and then tried to drag Ukraine into NATO and basically shut the Russians out, making their security position untenable. Belatedly, the Russians woke up. They obviously did have plans in place to do what they did in Crimea, and then they didn't seem to quite know what they were going to do with regard to eastern Ukraine. They helped the sponsorship of a number of local republics that were declared. Lugansk, Donetsk. People forget there were republics declared in Kharkov and Odessa as well, maybe elsewhere, I don't recall. But when those republics declared they wanted to be independent of Ukraine in 2014, the Russians said, no, you have to stay in Ukraine. We want you to stay in Ukraine. We want to Ukraine, and that's where we got the Minsk agreement. These oblasts will stay in Ukraine, but Ukraine will be decentralized. It will allow free use of the Russian language, things like that. I think the Russians thought that would at least guarantee that Ukraine would not be a threat to them. What they probably did not anticipate was how dogged the Western powers would be in not fulfilling that agreement. Instead, trying to build Ukraine up as a base against Russia, first to subdue the Donbass region, and then for building up military assets that would be a threat to Russia. That's why I think only very, very reluctantly did they do what they did in November, when they finally felt that, okay, if it's going to be a confrontation with the West, we've got the resources, we've got our economy shielded against sanctions, we've built up our military forces, we'll give them one last chance to come to the negotiating table, and if they won't do it, okay, we'll have to do what we have to do. Now, was that the right decision for Russia or for the world? I don't know, but the question I always ask is, what was their alternative? Were they just supposed to sit there and wait until Ukraine to be built up as this big base to attack the Donbass, to plant American missiles there and so forth? They couldn't just sit there and do that. Well, they could have negotiated. Well, they tried to negotiate, but nobody would talk to them about this stuff. So what were they going to do? I don't have an answer to that.
I got to tell you guys about a few new products over at our favorite CBD store. That's, of course, Paloma Verde CBD.com. The first thing I'm going to tell you about that's brand new over there is these THCV gummies. There's 10 milligrams of THCV per gummy and 10 gummies per jar. A lot of y'all are probably familiar with this THCV. Some people call it diet weed. It's very good for intermittent fasters. THCV helps suppress or dull your appetite, which, of course, a little bit unlike regular THC that, as you probably know, or at least you've heard, can give you the munchies. THCV helps promote energy, unlike regular THC, which, of course, makes you feel kind of mellow. This is legal, oh my God, legal under the Farm Bill. So thank you, Farm Bill. The second thing I want to tell you about that's new over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com is their full spectrum nano CBD soft gels. These have the perfect amount of CBD with THC. 25 milligrams of CBD and 0.27 milligrams of THC per soft gel. Their everyday formula brings your body back to homeostasis and adds this nice extra layer of chill. I like that. I think you do too. A lot of us need that now and again, or maybe every day. Nanotechnology allows better absorption into your body, even better than their other products, which was already amazing. Again, this has a calming effect and it lasts about 6 to 8 hours. And of course, like the other stuff, it's legal under what? The Farm Bill. Thank you, Farm Bill. It's legal. I would not get you guys in trouble. Go over to PalomaVerdeCBD.com. They've got a lot of great products. I talk about them all the time. The massage oil. They've got the sleep bundle. They got nano CBD soft gels, CBD bath bombs, which are amazing. Gummies, tinctures, all of that stuff. Of course, for my French bulldogs, Lux and George, the pet tinctures and the pet gummies. All of these things are over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Oh yeah, did I tell you about the cool menthol sports cream? Of course I have before. It's the best sports cream in the world. I get reviews from customers on this all the time. That's the number one thing I like from this company. And they've got all of these great things. Over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com, you will get a promo code because Carlos and Vanessa, the owners, love this show and they want to help out the listeners of this show. Promo code BUCK at checkout gets you 20% off of your order over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code BUCK at checkout gets you 20% off of your order. Go give them business and in turn, give me business. Now, let's get back to the show. What's the Ukraine government? What does that represent to you? Because again, I want people to understand when we're saying Ukraine versus Russia, America's role in this, we're not talking about the people in the country. This is the Ukrainian government. This is NATO. What does the Ukrainian government represent?
Well, it's obviously the most democratic country in the world because they've shut down all the opposition parties and shut down all the opposition media. That's democracy there, because after all, if they're not pro-democracy, you shouldn't be allowed to participate in politics or operate a media outlet. I wouldn't say they don't represent anybody, but I don't know how much of the Ukrainian population they represent. Certainly, there are a lot of people in far western Ukraine, the areas that dealing majority non-Orthodox part of the country in the far west, that were part of Poland or before that the Austrian Empire, that are very, very militantly anti-Russian, and that's where the large, really radical national groups like the Svoboda Party and others are based, Pravy Sector. But as far as the rest of the country goes, I don't know. The East tends to be, in the South, tends to be Russian-speaking and more pro-Russian. Crimea was solidly so. How much some people there also have gotten used to 30 years of independent statehood, the idea that somehow the West is good and Russia is bad, I don't know. The further west in Ukraine, the more that opinion is going to grow. I think it really, really varies. But I also think that if you look at the history of Ukraine from the pre-revolutionary era through the Soviet era, what you see is a lot of malleability of opinion, that people's opinions change with circumstances. For example, a lot of people point to a referendum was held in late 1991 where almost all of Ukraine voted with a very heavy majority in favor of an independent state. Well, see, Ukrainians want to be independent. Well, December of 1991, it was pretty clear the Soviet Union was already breaking up. They forget that in March of the same year, there had been an earlier referendum where a very heavy majority of the country, except for the far west, voted for remaining in a common state with the rest of what had been the Soviet Union. So depending on the circumstances, opinions change. I wouldn't be at all that surprised if once this war is over and people, even pro-Western Ukrainians, see, you know what? The West didn't give a damn about us. They didn't want us at all. They just wanted us to use us as a club against the Russians, and they were perfectly happy to get as many of us killed as possible in trying to bring the Russians down. What do we need them for? And I wonder about that. I always wonder somehow if what I think will be an upcoming defeat of Ukraine in this war will yield in the not too distant future some very pro-Russian Ukrainians. Just like, for example, who do we see at the spear tip in this war on the Russian side? The Chechens, who had just been defeated very heavily by Russian forces in their own homeland. Now they're out there fighting under the Russian flag as some of their most militant fighters. Hey, what's the only part of the United States that was defeated and subjugated by violence? The South. Well, which is the most patriotic and pro-military part of the United States and has been for many, many years and just decades after all the late unpleasantness? The South. Look at the Highlanders in Scotland after they were repressed by the British Empire. Within a couple of decades, they're the shock troops of the British Empire. So people's perspectives change depending on circumstances. At this point, I think the only one Zelensky really represents is London and Washington.
I do too. It seems to me, and this is just a feeling I get from watching stuff go down with Zelensky and Biden and his family. It seems like Zelensky's government, or at least some structure there within there, is like a money laundering tool for rich elites in the United States of America. Do you see that at all?
Oh, sure. They call that doing well by doing good.
Yeah.
That you're on God's mission to bring Ukraine west and bring them the benefits of drag queen story hour or whatever our religion is this week. And but at the same time, if there's money to be made, everybody knows, for example, the whole episode with Joe Biden when he was vice president, and also the Obama administration's point man on Ukraine, going to Kiev and saying that this guy, Viktor Shokin, the prosecutor who was looking into Burisma, had to be fired or no money for you guys. And well, son of a bitch, he got fired, as the vice president said at the time. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of money that can be made there for people with the right connections. What's interesting to me, by the way, is even the people who have been looking into this in the West, nobody's ever bothered, as far as I know, to talk to Viktor Shokin. The prosecutor got fired. I need to tell you, I had some friends in Kiev, this is back when I was still working, who approached me saying, listen, Viktor Shokin needs representation. He needs to get his side of the story out about what's really going on here. And we talked back and forth about putting together some kind of effort on his behalf. Nothing ever came of it. But I do wonder, even the people who say, hey, what's going on with Hunter Biden and all that? Why do somebody should talk to that guy. I don't even know where he is right now. There are a lot of people that, a lot of people have been disappeared in Kiev and elsewhere in Ukraine since this war started. One guy I know in particular, Dmitry Jangirov, he was, videotaped looking all beat up and harassed after the SBU pulled him in. I haven't heard anything else what happened to him since. And I wonder.
What countries, as far as actual legitimate power go, what countries are on our, quote unquote, our side? And by that, I mean the United States. Who does the United States look to for partnership in this? Well,
let's remember, we don't have partners. We have satellites.
Yeah, fair.
Right. We have satellites and we have enemies. It's, back during the first Cold War, it was respectable to be a neutral. Austria was neutral. Finland was neutral, right? And this was, Switzerland obviously was neutral. Sweden was neutral. Nowadays, with the, just like in American politics, where there's only two sides, one or the other. There's no common ground anymore. That's the way it is in the world situation now too. So what we have is countries primarily the European Union and NATO countries, which are almost congruent, not entirely, but very close to it. And then we have our satellites in South Korea and Japan, and then Oceania with Australia and New Zealand. They're, quote, on our side because they're obedient little puppets who do what they're told and say what they're told. Now, that's part of the problem, obviously, with things like, the Nord Stream pipeline and all of this. At what point do the people in Europe, especially, wake up and smell the coffee and say, wait a minute, we don't have a dog in this fight. Why are we destroying our own economies? Because remember, it's not even the Russians doing it. It's their own stupid sanctions that are having this effect on their economy. How much farther down this road of destroying our own country are we going to go? Because Big Brother in Washington tells us we have to. So we do have, I would say, some enthusiastic satellites that are along for the ride. Certainly the Canadians and Justin Trudeau, or Fidel Castro's son, whoever he is. And then the Brits, as usual. Some of the Scandinavians, the Danes and the Norwegians, the Poles, certainly. The Poles are the most militant of the group. They seem bent on making the same mistake they made in 1939 of being on bad terms with both the Russians and the Germans. But that's okay. Our friends across the sea will come save us. Well, that didn't work out for them very well in 1939. Right. And of course, the Baltic states. The Baltic states, again, feel that they can be the mice that roar because the United States is going to watch out for them, even though everybody concedes that if it really comes to a confrontation directly with the Russians and NATO, the Baltic states are not defensible. Everybody knows this. So I would say those are the most militant of our partners in this. And only one, I would say possibly the Poles, are actually out front of the United States in terms of militancy.
Does Israel play a role in this conflict?
It does. I've heard that there is a lot of Israeli intelligence assets, Mossad, in Ukraine. At the same time, I just saw a report that the Ukrainians asked to buy the Israeli Iron Dome anti-aircraft, anti-missile system, and the Israelis declined to sell it to them. As I understand it, opinion in Ukraine, in Israel, is divided. Zelensky is Jewish. The Speaker of the Parliament is Jewish. I'm sure that's part of what their sympathies would be with Ukraine. Part of it is that you have an awful lot of people in Israel from the former Soviet Union. Many are from Ukraine. Many are from Russia. And so a lot of them tend to have sympathies based on their experiences there. Some good, some bad, by the way. I mean, some people come from Russia, and that's why they're anti-Russian. And some people come from Ukraine. That's why they're anti-Ukrainian. So it's now in terms of the big picture, in terms of Israeli influence on American foreign policy, I don't know. And obviously, that's huge. I don't know that that's particularly important in this context. What I think is important, and it's not exactly an Israeli influence, but more of maybe like an ethnic Jewish agenda, is that you do have people, like Blinken, Victoria Nuland, Wendy Sherman, other people in the administration who have this kind of, you're familiar with the term neoconservatism, this kind of a reformed Trotskyite way of looking at the world, permanent revolution, we're going to impose, democracy, human rights on the rest of the world, the way we understand those things. I think for some people of Jewish background, this has a kind of a messianic aspect of it to it. The same way it does domestically, for example, where you have people like Michael Lerner of Tikkun magazine saying that, American Jews should take credit for same-sex marriage, that somehow this is a great achievement for Jews as such. I'm sure a lot of other Jews certainly disagree with that. But you do have some people with that mentality in this administration, but they're not unique in this regard. Maybe they're most powerful in some ways. But I can remember back in the 80s and 90s, you had what I call the World War II Losers Association, where you had all these Central and Eastern European nationalities groups, Hungary and Croatia and places like this, who were very, very militant in American foreign policy in Eastern Europe because they weren't just anti-communists. They wanted to rearrange the borders to the way they were back in 1943. They had their own ethnic agenda. And I think one of the things that stuns me about Americans is, I come from a quote, ethnic background. A lot of Americans don't. They tend to be really tone deaf about this stuff. Oh, they're good anti-communists. Well, maybe they are, but maybe they're just out with an ethnic axe to grind. A lot of people are, and a lot of Americans simply don't notice it. I can remember people telling me in Washington, well, we have so much Jewish influence on our foreign policy in Israel. Maybe we need to have more Arabs and Muslims in America to counterbalance them. And I'm thinking, oh, yeah, that's not much of a solution. How about we start talking about what's the American interest, not what's the Jewish interest, what's the Muslim interest, what's the Greek interest, what's the Turkish interest, what's the Indian or the Pakistani interest? What is the American interest? And I think part of that is that since Americans have been so thoroughly denationalized and don't have any idea who and what an American is, we don't know what our interests are. And so that's why we tend to have ethnic or corporate interests driving our foreign policy rather than some reasoned sense of what's good for America. We don't have that anymore.
Why? Let me ask you this first, actually, before I want to ask more about the influence that Israel seems to play on our foreign policy and some of the things we that are done in the name of America over the years. Do you think the Orthodox Christian view of Israel is different from, let's say, the American Protestant view?
Of course, anything you say about Protestantism, you'd have to say which Protestant view, because there's
Fair.
almost as many Protestantisms as there are
Right.
Protestants. But if you're talking about specifically the evangelical Christian
Correct.
view and
Yes.
what they call the dispensationalist view, yes. And of course, not only is that not the Orthodox view, it's not the Roman Catholic view historically, it's not even the classic Protestant view. It really is only a view that derives from the middle of the 19th century with Charles Nelson Darby and the Schofield Study Bible, which had this bizarre scheme called dispensationalism, of the idea that there are, I think, 7 dispensations historically, each of them running concurrently. So, for example, they have this idea that somehow, contrary to everything in the scriptures, everything in what that St. Paul writes, that somehow Jews are saved by being good Jews rather than, like everybody else, Jew or Gentile, through Christ. And in fact, there are some groups, even like, for example, like Jews for Jesus, who are concerned that this is essentially a kind of an anti-Semitism. It's a renunciation of Jewish evangelism. That what does St. Paul write? To the Jew first, and then to the Greek. If anybody is meant for the gospel, it of course is the Jewish people, and that is being neglected by the dispensationalists. Instead, they seem to have tapped into kind of a political agenda, a kind of Christian Zionism, it's called, where simply supporting Jews as a community or Israel as such is the will of God. And they quote parts of the Old Testament to say this: I will bless those that bless thee and curse those that curse thee. But who is thee? It's not an ethnic group. It is Christ. It is the body of the church of which of course initially would have been the Kahal, the assembly of Israel, which then with the death and resurrection of Christ became the church, and then were added to it nations and tribes that we call the church. There also, it seems, is the dispensationalism is tied up with a lot of other crazy things, like the rapture, as it's misunderstood by evangelicals today. The idea that they're going to miss the reign of Antichrist, that there's going to be a literal 1,000-year reign, what they call chiliasm. And I would say that more traditional view, which is found in Orthodoxy, but also traditionally in Roman Catholicism and even the classic Protestantism, is that the Antichrist will come, according to the fathers. He will be a Jew of the tribe of Dan, and I don't know how many bona fide Danites you can find lurking around these days, but there's got to be somebody somewhere. That he will be a false Christ, that not only Jews, but many Christians, Muslims, Hindus, unbelievers, they all hail him as their Messiah, and that he will begin his tyrannical reign, which, if it were not for the sake of the church, would consume all flesh, and that God will cut it short. But that's the culmination of history. And by the way, in that regard, I would certainly direct people to Uncut Mountain Press. There's a wonderful book about the Antichrist and globalization that has been published by Uncut Mountain Press by Gregory Davis. I wrote the epilogue to it.
He was on this show.
About it at their conference recently. And he was.
Yes.
Gregory, he was on the show.
He
Wonderful.
was,
yes.
Yeah.
And Father Spiridon Bailey has also endorsed the book. It really, because I think a lot of people miss the idea that what's been lurking throughout the period of the church for the last 2,000 years has been a kind of a counter church, this Gnostic tendency to undermine Christianity, and that Gnosticism will culminate in the reign of Antichrist, and we see many of that indications today. Now, does that mean Antichrist is going to set up tent next week? Maybe, or maybe 10,000 years from now. I don't know. But even in the gospel, it says, in the New Testament, it says that the mystery of iniquity worketh, and that once he that letteth, once he that restrains is taken out of the way, then we will see that man of sin revealed. That restraining order in the world, once by pious Orthodox Christian kings and other godly authorities, starting, by the way, with fathers and their families, is now being taken away in favor of feminism, homosexualism, and all these other things. There is no godly restraint that we are seeing much on the world scene anymore. Can that restraint be restored? Can that time be put off? Maybe so, and I hope so, but it's not a certainty.
Well, you already, basically with your answer there, you've answered something I was going to ask, and that's that, so many people will say there's some kind of degree of good versus bad guys here in this geopolitical battle. But ultimately, I assume, especially based on your answer and knowing you're Orthodox, you see this as a larger spiritual battle at play?
Absolutely. And sad to say, Buck, it's also going on in the Orthodox Church. You may have seen that recent video that came out about some of these groups like Fordham and the Huffington Center and this International Orthodox Theological Association that are trying to revise our church teachings, particularly on sexuality, but even on things like abortion, ordaining not just deaconesses, which is arguable, it's a bad argument, but it's arguable, but even female deacons, which is just absolutely impermissible. All these kind of people trying to do to our church what has already destroyed the Protestant denominations and is in the process of finishing off the Roman Catholic Church. And I have to ask the question, where are our bishops? Where are bishops talking about this assault against our church and within our church, including from some people calling themselves Orthodox Christians? It's something that I think it scandalizes people, and it certainly harms Orthodox evangelism. And something has got to be done about it because it's a spiritual battle. But and by the way, even in the Orthodox Church, a lot of people want to think in terms of, the Greeks are all squishy and the Russians are all standing firm. It's not quite so simple. It's across jurisdictional lines. It's true all the Orthodox countries as well as in places like America. It is a spiritual battle, a global spiritual battle in the fullest sense of the word.
Well, what do you see to come here? I don't want to taint your answer by saying let's assume that there's no nuclear action that happens, but at some point empires crumble. Ours is getting too big. I think it's been too big for a long time. Ron Paul always said that troops are going to have to come home one way or the other because at some point you can't even afford it. But what do you see happening to the West, the US empire and all of our satellites? And is this battle that's going on right now kind of going to lead to what your answer is in your mind?
It's an interesting question. As that great philosopher Yogi Berra said, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. Robert E. Lee said in a letter he wrote after the war, I think to Lord Acton, if I'm not mistaken, that consolidated American government would be sure to be despotic at home and aggressive abroad.
Yeah.
And was he wrong? Clearly that's what's happened. The way I tend to look at the development of our republic, for the first 80 or 90 years, we had a confederal republic. And then for about 100 years, we had a federal democracy. And now it's where we have something consolidated, bureaucratic, demagogic state descending into tyranny. That's the logic of republics anyway. That's, the founding fathers would not have been surprised, I don't think, and neither would Aristotle have been surprised. What does that mean for the global empire? It can mean a couple of things. If somehow our wokesters manage to come out on top, destroy the Russians, and then probably after that destroy the Chinese, really there's nobody that can oppose us at that point. Then we can sit down, they can sit down to digest it for a long time. We will all end up eating bugs and living in pods. That's what they want for us. That's what they want for the whole world. And also, let's not forget the depopulation agenda. these people are demonically motivated, in my opinion. That depopulation, enmity for the human race. What does it say in the scriptures? The devil was a liar from the beginning, a murderer from the beginning. He's a liar from the beginning. He is a liar. There's a huge anti-human animus at the root of this, which is demonic in origin. If that fails somehow because this war and the global economic and financial battle go against them, and we do have a crisis within, first in Europe, but then also in the United States. Also, by the way, God only knows what's going to happen in the third world. I mean, just like in siege warfare, the most vulnerable, the ones who really starve and die first. What's going to happen in Africa, Latin America, a lot of the third world, when the global economy takes a nosedive? Can they somehow jump ship and get on board with a rising Eurasian economy? I don't know. I mean, that's a lot of speculation. But I think the essence of it, I hope, is that just like you do have countries like Russia or Hungary, to some extent even Poland, that have some sense of who they are and what their national and religious traditions are, I hope that can happen in other countries. I hear mixed things about Ms. Meloni in Italy, about whether she's going to put Italy first, whether she's going to put Christian values first. Other people say maybe not. I hope that can happen in Europe as a whole, in the United States at some point, but maybe we're too far gone for that. When you look at America, for example, as I like to point out, in 1861, we agreed on our constitutional principles, on Christianity, on the Bible, and all that. Now we don't even know what our pronouns are or what a woman is. We don't really live in the same mental and moral universe with about half the country. Can you really put a country back together again on that basis? And I don't know. Especially since one solution might be to split the country up, but I don't think the wokesters can do that because they depend on the solid citizens and the productive people to support the apparatus of power. And so what they really need to do is subdue flyover country. And I don't know if they can do it. I think they'll try, certainly.
Well, that sounds like a good ending point. Are you optimistic at all about, let me ask you it this way. Are you more optimistic short-term or long-term, or neither?
Well, certainly long term, when price comes back, I'm extremely optimistic. You can't fail to be optimistic on that. In the term just before that, you've got to be pessimistic because we know who will be ruling the world at that point. In the near to midterm, I'm cautiously pessimistic that I don't see in material terms or even in spiritual terms, with a small s, just in terms of morale and so forth. I don't see how the wokesters win this war in Ukraine. I don't see how they salvage institutions like NATO and the European Union. I am cautiously optimistic those could collapse, and if they do, maybe there's an opening for something healthy to come out of that. But that means a lot of turmoil, and that's where the pessimism comes in. Mm-hmm. A lot of turmoil, a lot of grief, a lot of violence, a lot of hunger. And I don't think it's avoidable at this point.
Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of wokesters in the food line. Once you're at that point in a bread line, you're starving. Hopefully, I mean, I don't want that to happen, but there's not a lot of room for pronouns and woke ideology at that point. So, it's kind of like the no Christians in a foxhole. We shall see. Excuse me, not no atheists in a foxhole. I said that one wrong. Mr. Jim Jatras, is there anything you'd like to plug? Any of your work or Twitter, anything before we get out of here?
No, just at Jim Jatras on Twitter. That's my only social media platform. The only other thing I would add is, like I said, some of my writings in Strategic Culture Foundation Chronicles magazine on uns.org. In fact, I can send you links to those if you want to post those, and along with the video. And that's sort of where to find me. And other than that, I try to be responsive to people when they contact me and want to talk to me, and for whatever that's worth. They say they want to pick my brains. I say, okay, pretty slim pickings. Go ahead.
Yeah, could you send me those links so I can post them for the show notes for this episode? Awesome.
Absolutely, sure.
Jim Jatras, thank you so much for being here on Counterflow.
Thank you. Really appreciate it, Buck.
Yes, sir. All right, I hope you guys got something out of that. And if you get something out of this podcast generally, you're welcome to contribute give me your money, damn it. Now I do sound like a politician, right? No, you're welcome to contribute over at patreon.com/counterflow. If you find value in this broadcast and these shows that I put out, you can give as little as $1 a month or as much as you want until your heart's content and your wallet's empty. I kid. But yeah, you're welcome to give if you'd like. And you can follow me on Twitter at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. You can find all of the things you need to find regarding this show at counterflowpodcast.com. Go to the YouTube page, hit that subscribe button. Just search Counterflow with Buck Johnson. You'll find us, and you can watch all of these interviews. All right, guys? Until next week, you guys have a good one.
You get split in fucking half, but I call the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.